The candle on the dresser flickered, and Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen in the middle of the grand bedchamber, her hands pressed together so tightly her knuckles turned white. Somewhere behind the heavy oak door, the sounds of the wedding celebration still echoed faintly through the halls of Ashcombe Manor. But in this room, there was only silence, and the silence terrified her more than any noise could have. Her mother's words from the night before repeated themselves in her mind, over and over, like a bell that would not stop ringing. Just tolerate it, Eleanor. Close your eyes and let it pass. That is what every woman before you has done, and that is what you will do too. Do not expect kindness. Do not expect gentleness. Expect only duty. Eleanor had nodded then, because what else could she do? She was 19 years old, and she had been raised to believe that a woman's feelings mattered far less than a woman's obedience. Her father's debts had grown too large to hide, and the only way to save the family name, the only way to keep the roof over her younger siblings' heads, was for her to marry a stranger. That stranger was now her husband, a man she had met only twice before today, a man whose title carried more weight than his character, at least in the eyes of everyone who had arranged this match. The door opened, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Alexander Hartley, the newlywed Duke of Ashcombe, stepped into the room. He was tall, with dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead, and eyes that seemed to study everything around him with quiet intensity. He was still dressed in his wedding attire, though he had removed his jacket, and the sight of him standing there, so calm and composed, made Eleanor's heart pound even faster. She had expected many things from this moment. She had expected coldness. She had expected indifference, or worse, cruelty disguised as duty. What she had not expected was for him to stop, just inside the doorway, and look at her, with an expression she could not quite name. It was not desire. It was not impatience. It was something closer to concern. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and steady. "Are you frightened of me?" The question caught her so completely off guard that for a moment she could not answer. No one had ever asked her such a thing before. No one had ever seemed to care whether she was frightened or not. She opened her mouth to give the answer she had been taught to give, the answer that required no feeling at all, but instead, to her own surprise, the truth came tumbling out.
"Yes,"
she whispered.
"I am."
Alexander did not move closer. Instead, he leaned back against the doorframe, as if giving her space, as if understanding that space was exactly what she needed. "Then you have nothing to fear tonight," he said. "I did not marry you to frighten you." Eleanor stared at him, unsure whether to believe her own ears. "My mother told me," she began, then stopped herself, embarrassed by how foolish the words might sound spoken aloud. "Tell me," Alexander said gently. "What did your mother tell you?" Eleanor's fingers twisted together. "She told me that marriage is not something a woman enjoys. She said I should simply endure whatever happens tonight, and every night after, because that is what wives do. She said love comes later, if it comes at all, but obedience comes first." For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. His jaw tightened, and something flickered behind his eyes that Eleanor could not read, something that looked almost like anger, though not directed at her. "Your mother was taught the same lesson by someone else," he said finally, "and that person was taught it by someone before them. It is a chain, Eleanor, passed from one generation of frightened women to the next, and I refuse to be another link in it." Eleanor blinked. She had not expected him to speak of such things so plainly, and certainly not on their wedding night, when tradition demanded silence and submission rather than conversation. "I did not ask for a wife who merely tolerates me," Alexander continued, walking slowly toward the window instead of toward her, giving her room to breathe. "I asked for a partner, someone who can sit beside me, argue with me when I am wrong, and trust me when I have earned that trust. Tolerance is not a marriage, Eleanor. It is a sentence, and I will not have you serving one beside me." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a tightness she had not realized was there until it began to loosen. She had spent the entire day preparing herself for disappointment, for pain, for the quiet erasure of everything she had once hoped a marriage might be. She had not prepared herself for a husband who spoke of partnership as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because someone should have told you the truth long before tonight," Alexander said, turning to face her again. "And because I do not want you lying awake beside me for the next 50 years, wondering when the man you tolerate will finally show his true colors." I would rather you know now. I am not that man." Eleanor searched his face for any sign of deception, any hint that his kindness was simply a performance, meant to lower her guard. She found none. Instead, she found a man who looked tired, not from the wedding festivities, but from something deeper, something that suggested he carried burdens of his own that had nothing to do with her. "You seem troubled," she said carefully. "Is something wrong?" Alexander's expression shifted, and for a brief instant, Eleanor caught a glimpse of vulnerability that surprised her more than anything else that had happened that night. He walked to the small writing desk near the window and picked up a folded letter that had been resting there, half hidden beneath a stack of papers. "There are matters within my family that require careful attention," he said, choosing his words with obvious care. "My father's death 2 years ago was sudden, and there are those who believe it was not as simple as it appeared. I have spent this past year trying to understand what truly happened, and I have made enemies in the process, enemies who are not pleased that I continue to ask questions." Eleanor's fear of the wedding night suddenly felt small compared to the weight of what he was describing. "Who would want to harm you?" she asked. "My cousin, Nathaniel Cross, stands to inherit everything should something happen to me," Alexander said quietly. "He has always resented that the title passed to my father's line rather than his own. I do not say this to frighten you, Eleanor, but because I believe you deserve honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Marrying me may not be the safe arrangement your family imagined it to be." Eleanor felt a strange mixture of fear and something else, something that felt almost like purpose. For the first time since she had learned of this marriage, she did not feel like a piece being moved across a chessboard by others. She felt like a person being trusted with the truth. "Then tell me everything," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "If I am to be your wife, I would rather stand beside you knowing the danger than be kept in the dark and left unprepared." Alexander studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened further, as though he had expected resistance, or fear, or perhaps tears, but had instead found resolve. "Very well," he said, "but not tonight. Tonight, you should rest. There will be time for all of this in the days ahead." He crossed the room, and, instead of moving toward her, as she had feared he might, he gestured toward the large bed with its embroidered coverlet. "You may have the bed to yourself," he said. "I will take the chair by the fire. There is no need for either of us to pretend tonight, Eleanor. Not until you are ready, and perhaps not even then, until trust has been properly earned between us." Eleanor stood in stunned silence as he settled into the armchair near the hearth, removing his boots and loosening his collar, as though preparing for an ordinary night's rest, rather than anything resembling what she had been warned to expect. She sat slowly on the edge of the bed, watching him, trying to reconcile the man before her with everything she had been told to anticipate. "You are not what I expected," she said finally. "Neither are you," Alexander replied, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth for the first time that evening. "I expected a bride who had been forced into silence her entire life. Instead, I find a woman who, despite everything she has been taught, still asked me a question when she could have simply nodded and stayed quiet. That took courage, Eleanor. Do not lose it, not even for me." Eleanor lay back against the pillows, her mind spinning, with everything that had happened in the span of a single hour. She thought of her mother's warning, the resigned voice, the tired eyes that had seen too many years of quiet suffering disguised as duty. She thought of how different this night had turned out to be, how different this man was from the shadow she had feared would replace her freedom. As the fire crackled softly and Alexander's breathing grew slow and even in the chair across the room, Eleanor stared up at the ceiling, turning his words over and over in her mind. Tolerance is not a marriage. It is a sentence. She did not know yet what dangers lay ahead, what enemies waited in the shadows of Ashcombe Manor, or what secrets still needed to be uncovered about the death of the previous Duke. But she knew, with a certainty she had never felt before, that whatever came next, she would not simply endure it. She would face it, and for the first time in her life, she would not face it alone. Outside, beyond the thick glass of the bedchamber window, a single rider sat motionless, on his horse, at the edge of the estate's long drive, watching the candlelight flicker in the window of the ducal chamber. He did not move for a long while. Then, satisfied with whatever he had seen, he turned his horse and disappeared into the darkness of the surrounding trees. leaving no trace behind except the faint sound of hooves fading into silence. She did not yet know that her wedding night, the night she had feared more than any other in her life, was only the beginning of a much larger storm that had already begun to gather around the walls of her new home. But sleep, when it finally came, was gentler than she had expected. And when she woke the next morning to find Alexander already dressed and waiting for her with a look of quiet determination on his face, she understood that whatever came next, everything her mother had taught her about marriage, was about to be proven wrong, piece by piece, day by day. The sun rose higher over Ashcombe Manor, casting long golden light across the gardens below, and somewhere within those walls, a letter sealed with wax, the color of dried blood, sat waiting on a table, in a locked study, 3 floors below, unread and unnoticed. Its message, meant for eyes that would not see it, until it was almost too late. 3 days after the wedding, Eleanor found herself standing in the west corridor of Ashcombe Manor, at an hour when most of the household was still asleep, drawn there by a sound she could not quite place. It was faint, almost like the scraping of a drawer being pulled open too quickly, coming from behind the door of the locked study Alexander had mentioned only once, in passing, as a room she need not concern herself with. She hesitated outside the door, her candle casting flickering shadows against the dark wood paneling. She told herself she should turn back, that whatever business belonged to that room belonged to her husband alone, but the sound came again, followed by a soft curse in a voice she did not recognize, and every instinct she possessed told her that something was wrong. Eleanor pressed her palm against the door and found it slightly ajar. She pushed it open just enough to see inside, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A man she had never met before, dressed in dark traveling clothes, was rifling through the drawers of Alexander's writing desk, papers scattered across the floor around his boots. Before she could decide whether to scream or flee, the stranger looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he lunged toward the window, threw it open, and disappeared into the early morning mist before Eleanor could even find her voice to call for help. By the time Alexander reached the study, roused from his own chamber by the sound of Eleanor's cry, she was kneeling on the floor, gathering the scattered papers with trembling hands. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt beside her, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of harm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. "No," Eleanor said, though her hands were still shaking. "He was here, searching through your desk. He went out the window when he saw me." Alexander's expression darkened as he surveyed the room, taking stock of what had been disturbed. He crossed to the desk and checked a small hidden compartment beneath the bottom drawer, releasing a breath of relief when he found its contents undisturbed. "What were they looking for?" Eleanor asked, rising to her feet and brushing off her skirts. Alexander did not answer immediately. He gathered the remaining papers from the floor, his jaw tight with restrained anger. "Evidence," he said finally. "Evidence that connects my cousin to my father's death. I have been collecting it slowly, carefully, because accusing a man of Nathaniel's standing without proof would only end in my own ruin." Eleanor stared at the papers in his hands, her earlier fear giving way to something firmer, something that felt almost like resolve. "Show me," she said. Alexander looked at her with surprise. "Eleanor, this is not something I wish to burden you with so soon after our wedding." "You already told me the danger was real," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I would rather understand what we are facing than be left to imagine it. Please, Alexander, let me help." For a long moment, Alexander studied her, as though weighing something important in his mind. Then, slowly, he nodded and gestured for her to sit beside him at the desk. He spread the papers before them, a collection of letters, ledgers, and notes that had been gathered over the past year. "My father was a careful man," Alexander began. "He rarely made mistakes, and he was in excellent health before his death. Yet on the night he died, the physician who examined him noted symptoms that did not match any illness he had ever suffered before. Within a week, that physician left the country and has not been heard from since." Eleanor leaned closer, examining a letter written in a hand she did not recognize. "This letter," she said, pointing to a line near the bottom. "It mentions a shipment arriving from the coast the same week your father passed. What was it?" Alexander took the letter and read it again, his brow furrowing. "I had not noticed that before," he admitted. "It could be nothing, or it could be everything." Together, they spent the next hour, poring over the documents. Eleanor asking questions that Alexander had not thought to ask himself, her fresh eyes catching details that his familiarity with the papers had allowed him to overlook. She noticed a pattern in the dates of certain transactions, a connection between a merchant in the nearby port town and a name that appeared twice in Nathaniel's own correspondence. "You have a gift for this," Alexander said, watching her trace the connections with a growing sense of astonishment. "Most people would see only scattered papers. You see a pattern." Eleanor felt a flush of pride she had not expected to feel, especially not from her own husband, especially not so soon into their marriage. "My father often complained that I asked too many questions," she admitted. "He said it was not becoming of a lady to notice such things." "Your father was wrong," Alexander said simply, and something in the certainty of his voice made Eleanor's heart swell in a way she did not fully understand yet. Their work was interrupted by a knock at the door. Alexander quickly gathered the papers and locked them away before calling for the visitor to enter. It was Mr. Collins, the estate steward, an older man with a kind face and worried eyes. "Your Grace," he said, bowing slightly. "Forgive the intrusion, but a message has arrived from town. Lord Nathaniel Cross requests an audience this afternoon. He says it concerns matters of the estate that require immediate attention." Alexander's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, though Eleanor, who had spent the morning learning to read the subtle shifts in his face, noticed it immediately. "Tell him I will receive him at 3 o'clock, Alexander said. "And Collins, please ensure that the study remains locked at all times from now on. No exceptions." "Of course, Your Grace," Collins said, casting a curious glance at the scattered papers still visible on the desk, before bowing again and departing. Once the door closed, Eleanor turned to Alexander. "He is coming here, today?" "It seems he wishes to test how much I know," Alexander said. "Or perhaps he wishes to remind me of his presence, to unsettle me. Either way, we must be careful in how we receive him." "We?" Eleanor asked. Alexander looked at her, and something in his gaze had changed since their conversation on the wedding night. "If you are willing, I would like you present when he arrives. Nathaniel is a man who prides himself on reading people. Perhaps having someone new in the room, someone he does not yet understand, will unsettle him more than he expects." Eleanor felt a thrill of nervous excitement at the prospect, an emotion so foreign to the quiet resignation she had been trained to feel, that it took her a moment to recognize it for what it was. Courage. "I will be there," she said. The hours before Nathaniel's arrival passed slowly, filled with quiet preparation. Eleanor changed into a gown of deep blue, one that made her feel composed and dignified rather than fragile, and she practiced keeping her expression neutral in the mirror, the way she imagined a woman who belonged in rooms of power might appear. When 3 o'clock finally arrived, Nathaniel Cross entered the drawing room with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world owed him something it had not yet delivered. He was handsome in a sharp, calculated way, his smile never quite reaching his eyes as he bowed over Eleanor's hand. "The new Duchess," he said smoothly. "What a pleasure. I confess I did not expect Alexander to marry someone with such a keen look about her. You have the eyes of a woman who notices things, my dear." "I have been told that before," Eleanor replied evenly, refusing to let his words unsettle her, "though I have always considered it a compliment rather than a warning." Nathaniel's smile flickered for just a moment before he turned his attention to Alexander, and the conversation shifted to matters of the estate, tenant disputes, and upcoming harvest reports. Eleanor listened carefully, watching Nathaniel's expressions, noting how his eyes drifted toward the locked study door on more than one occasion, how his questions seemed designed to probe rather than to inform. Toward the end of the visit, as Nathaniel rose to take his leave, he paused near the doorway and turned back, with an expression that sent a chill through Eleanor's spine. "It is a shame about your father, Alexander," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Such a sudden loss. I do hope you are not still troubling yourself with questions that can only bring you grief. Some matters, cousin, are better left buried with the dead." Alexander's expression remained perfectly composed, though Eleanor could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "I appreciate your concern, Nathaniel," he said, "but I find that questions, once asked, have a way of demanding answers, whether we wish to hear them or not." Nathaniel's smile did not waver, but something cold passed behind his eyes, before he bowed once more and departed, his footsteps echoing down the hall until the front door closed behind him, with a heavy, final sound. Once he was gone, Eleanor turned to Alexander, her heart still pounding from the tension of the encounter. "He knows something," she said. "Or he suspects that you know something." "Yes," Alexander said quietly, staring at the closed door, as though he could still see his cousin's calculating smile lingering there. "And that means we are running out of time to prove it, before he decides to act." Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle over her, but rather than the fear she once might have felt, she found herself steadied by a new sense of purpose. Whatever came next, she would not be a silent observer standing at the edges of her own life. She would stand beside her husband, and together they would uncover the truth, whatever the cost. That night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor found a small folded note tucked beneath her pillow. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, half expecting a threat from Nathaniel himself. Instead, she found Alexander's handwriting, simple and direct. "Thank you for standing with me today. I do not think I properly understood, until this moment, how much stronger two people can be than one." Eleanor pressed the note to her chest and smiled softly into the quiet darkness of her room, unaware that in the stables below, a groundskeeper was discovering that one of the estate's fastest horses had gone missing sometime during Nathaniel's visit, along with a small leather satchel that had been hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the tack room for over a year. The missing satchel was discovered gone the following morning, and with it, 3 weeks of quiet investigation seemed to unravel in an instant. Alexander paced the length of his study, running a hand through his hair as Mr. Collins explained, with visible distress, that the groundskeeper had found the hiding place empty, and the lock forced open sometime during the previous night. "It contained letters," Alexander said, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "Letters between my father and a merchant named Percival Grant. Letters that proved a shipment arriving the week of my father's death was never what it claimed to be on the manifest." Eleanor, who had risen early after a restless night, stood near the window with her arms crossed, thinking carefully before she spoke. If Nathaniel took them, he must have sent someone during his visit yesterday, or shortly after. Someone who knew exactly where to look. Which means someone within these walls told him where to search, Alexander finished grimly. The room fell silent, as the implications settled over them. Mr. Collins looked deeply uncomfortable, and Eleanor noticed his hands twisting together nervously, before he cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "there is something I feel I must tell you, though I confess I do not know if it holds any importance." Alexander turned to him sharply. "Speak, Collins. The stable boy mentioned to me this morning that he saw one of the new kitchen maids near the tack room 2 nights past, though she has no reason to be there at that hour. Her name is Bridget. She was hired only a month before your father's passing." Eleanor felt a jolt of recognition. She had noticed the young woman before, always quiet, always watching from the edges of rooms, with an attentiveness that seemed unusual for someone in her position. "Bring her here," Eleanor said, quietly, so as not to alarm the rest of the household. It took nearly an hour before Bridget was found and brought to the study, her face pale and her hands trembling as she stood before the Duke and Duchess. Eleanor recognized the fear in her eyes immediately, the same fear she herself had carried into this house only days before, and she softened her approach accordingly. "Bridget," she said gently, kneeling slightly so that she was not looking down at the frightened young woman. "We do not wish to frighten you. We only want to understand what has happened, and we believe you may know something that could help us." Bridget's eyes darted toward Alexander, then back to Eleanor, before tears began to spill down her cheeks. "He said he would help my brother," she whispered. "My brother owes money to men who would hurt him if it is not repaid. Lord Nathaniel promised to clear the debt if I simply told him certain things, where papers were kept." When the Duke left his study unattended, Eleanor felt a wave of sympathy mixed with frustration. She glanced at Alexander, who remained still, his expression unreadable, though Eleanor had come to recognize the careful control he exercised over his features when his true feelings ran deep. "Did you take the satchel from the tack room?" Alexander asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Bridget shook her head fiercely. "No, Your Grace. I swear it. I only told him where such things were sometimes hidden, from things I overheard the old steward mention before he retired. I never went near the stables myself. I would not know how to break a lock even if I tried." Eleanor believed her. There was a rawness to the girl's fear that felt too genuine to be performance, and she reached out to place a reassuring hand on Bridget's arm. "Then someone else took the letters," Eleanor said, thinking aloud. "Someone with more skill than a frightened kitchen maid. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. Nathaniel would not risk coming himself, and he would not trust an amateur with something so important. He must employ someone more experienced for tasks such as this. After Bridget was sent away, with a promise from Alexander that her brother's debt would be quietly settled in exchange for her honesty, Eleanor and Alexander sat together in the now dimly lit study, the weight of the morning's revelations settling heavily between them. "We need proof that does not rely on documents that can simply be stolen away," Eleanor said finally. "Something Nathaniel cannot simply reach into our home and take." "What do you suggest?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious rather than dismissive, a tone Eleanor was quickly growing accustomed to and quietly grateful for. "The merchant," Eleanor said. "Percival Grant. If he is still alive and still in the port town, perhaps he remembers more than what was written in those letters. Papers can be stolen, but a man's memory cannot be so easily taken from him, not unless someone silences him entirely." Alexander's eyes sharpened with interest. "You wish to travel to the coast." "I wish for us to travel to the coast," Eleanor corrected, "together. If Nathaniel has spies within these walls, then this house is no longer the safest place to continue our investigation. We should seek the truth where it began, not wait here for it to be stolen from beneath us again." Alexander studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. The desire to protect her weighed against the growing respect he clearly held for her judgment. Finally, he nodded slowly. "We will leave within 2 days, under the pretense of visiting my aunt in the neighboring county. It will give us cover, and it will not raise suspicion." The 2 days that followed passed in careful preparation. Eleanor found herself drawn into a world she had never imagined for herself, one of coded messages, careful alibis, and quiet strategy. She and Alexander spent hours reviewing what remained of their scattered notes, committing key details to memory rather than paper, wary now of what could be stolen or discovered. On the morning of their departure, as their carriage pulled away from Ashcombe Manor under the gray light of early dawn, Eleanor glanced back at the imposing structure of her new home, uncertain when they might return, or what they might find waiting for them when they did. "You are quiet," Alexander observed, seated across from her in the carriage, his eyes studying her with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "I am thinking of my mother," Eleanor admitted. "She would be horrified to know what I am doing now, chasing down secrets and confronting danger, instead of sitting quietly at home, waiting for whatever fate my husband decided to hand me." Alexander's expression softened. "Would she be horrified?" he asked. "Or would some part of her be proud, even if she could never say so aloud?" Eleanor considered this for a long moment, watching the passing countryside through the carriage window. "I do not know," she said honestly. "Perhaps both. She has spent so long believing that women must simply endure their circumstances that I am not certain she remembers what it feels like to imagine changing them instead." Alexander reached across the carriage and, for the first time since their wedding night, gently took her hand in his. "Then perhaps, when this is over, we will show her," he said. "Not through words, but through the life we build together. Sometimes people cannot be convinced by argument alone. Sometimes they must simply witness something different to believe it is possible." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth that had nothing to do with fear or duty, and everything to do with the growing bond forming between them, forged not through grand declarations, but through shared purpose and quiet trust. The journey to the coast took the better part of 2 days, with stops at modest inns along the way, where Alexander insisted on paying for separate rooms, out of respect for Eleanor's comfort, despite the curious glances such an arrangement drew from innkeepers, accustomed to newlywed couples behaving quite differently. As they drew closer to the port town where Percival Grant was rumored to still reside, a heavy fog rolled in from the sea, wrapping the narrow streets in a gray haze that made every shadow seem to hold secrets of its own. Eleanor pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders as their carriage came to a stop outside a modest house near the harbor, its windows dark despite the late afternoon hour. "Something feels wrong," Eleanor murmured, studying the silent house before them. Alexander's hand moved instinctively to the pistol concealed beneath his coat, a precaution Eleanor had not even realized he carried until this moment. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, and together they approached the front door, which stood slightly ajar despite the evening chill. "Mr. Grant," Alexander called into the darkened hallway, his voice steady despite the tension Eleanor could feel radiating from him. "It is Alexander Hartley. I wrote to you some weeks ago." Silence answered him, thick and unsettling. Eleanor's heart pounded as they stepped further into the house, the fading light casting long shadows across overturned furniture and scattered papers that told a story of hurried searching, or perhaps something far worse. They found the study at the back of the house in complete disarray, drawers pulled open and emptied, books thrown carelessly from their shelves. But it was not the disorder that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. It was the folded note left deliberately in the center of the desk, addressed in careful handwriting, to whoever might come looking. Alexander picked it up with trembling hands and read it aloud, his voice growing tighter with every word. "Mr. Grant has taken an extended journey abroad for his health. Those who continue asking questions about matters long settled would be wise to consider their own well-being before pursuing answers further." Eleanor felt a chill run through her entire body. There was no signature, no name attached to the warning, but the meaning was unmistakably clear. Someone had reached Percival Grant before they had, and whatever information the merchant possessed had either been silenced or spirited away entirely. "We are too late," Eleanor whispered. Alexander's jaw tightened as he folded the note and slipped it into his coat pocket, his eyes scanning the ransacked room with a mixture of frustration and something far more dangerous simmering beneath the surface. "Not too late," he said firmly. "Only delayed. Whoever did this made a mistake, Eleanor. They left evidence of their own urgency, and urgency means fear. Someone is worried about what we might discover, which means we are closer to the truth than they would like us to believe." Outside, the fog continued to thicken around the harbor, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the edge of the lamplight, a figure watched the house from a narrow alleyway, waiting patiently to see what the Duke and his new Duchess would do next, before slipping away into the gathering night to deliver word of what he had witnessed to a man who was growing increasingly desperate to protect a secret that had already cost one life, and seemed willing to cost more before it was finally buried for good. They spent the night at a small inn near the harbor, taking rooms under assumed names at Alexander's insistence, a precaution that Eleanor now understood was not overcaution, but necessity. She lay awake for hours, listening to the distant sound of waves against the docks, turning over every detail of Percival Grant's abandoned house in her mind. The following morning, over a quiet breakfast in a private corner of the inn's dining room, Eleanor voiced a thought that had been forming in her mind since they had discovered the note the previous evening. "Whoever did this could not have simply vanished a man without help," she said. "Someone in this town must know what became of him. A merchant does not disappear without leaving some trace behind, not entirely." Alexander nodded slowly, setting down his cup. "The harbor master would know of any ships that departed recently, and dock workers see everything, even when they pretend otherwise. But we must be careful how we ask. Word travels quickly in towns this small, and we do not know who else might be watching for us." Eleanor considered this for a moment, before an idea took shape. "What if we did not ask as ourselves?" she suggested. "What if I went to the market as a woman, seeking information about a missing relative, someone with no connection to titles or estates? People speak more freely to those they believe hold no power over them." Alexander studied her with an expression of growing admiration. "You continue to surprise me," he said. "Very well. But I will not be far. If anything feels wrong, you are to return to me immediately. Understood?" Eleanor agreed, and within the hour, she found herself walking through the bustling harbor market alone, dressed in a plainer gown, borrowed from the innkeeper's wife, her hair covered simply beneath a woolen shawl. She moved between stalls of fish and rope and dried goods, listening carefully to conversations, asking gentle questions of an elderly woman selling bread about a merchant named Grant who used to live nearby. The woman's face grew guarded at the mention of the name. "You would do well not to ask about that one too loudly," she said quietly, glancing around before leaning closer. "Strange men came through here not 2 weeks past, asking after him themselves, though not so kindly as you. My grandson works the docks. He says a ship left in the middle of the night, no proper manifest filed, no passengers recorded, yet he swears he saw a man matching Grant's description being led aboard, looking none too willing about it." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Do you know where the ship was bound?" The old woman shook her head. "Only that it flew no flag he recognized, and it left before the tide was even fully in, which no honest captain would risk. without good reason to hurry. Eleanor thanked the woman and pressed a few extra coins into her hand before making her way back toward the inn, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. When she relayed the information to Alexander, his expression grew grim. "A ship with no manifest, leaving under cover of darkness," he murmured. "That takes considerable resources and considerable willingness to break the law entirely. Nathaniel does not act alone in this. He has help from someone with connections beyond the reach of ordinary justice." "Who would have such connections?" Eleanor asked. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the gray harbor waters. "There is a man named Silas Reeve," he said finally. "My father once mentioned him in passing, a merchant with dealings in less than reputable trade, smuggling among other things. If Nathaniel has aligned himself with someone like Reeve, then the danger we face is far greater than a cousin merely hoping to inherit a title through patience." Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door of their private room. Alexander rose immediately, motioning for Eleanor to move toward the far corner of the room while he approached cautiously, one hand resting near his concealed pistol. It was only the innkeeper, delivering a folded message that had been left for them at the front desk by a boy who had not given his name, before disappearing back into the crowded street. Alexander unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes scanning its contents, and Eleanor watched the color drain slightly from his face as he read. "What does it say?" she asked, unable to bear the suspense any longer. Alexander handed her the note without a word. Eleanor's eyes moved quickly across the short, precise message. "Return to Ashcombe immediately. Your sister has fallen gravely ill. Time may be short." Eleanor felt her stomach twist with worry. "Isabella," she said. Alexander's younger sister had always struck Eleanor as full of warmth and life during their brief interactions before the wedding, and the thought of her suffering filled Eleanor with genuine distress. "We must return at once," Alexander said, already moving to gather their belongings, though something in his tense expression suggested more than simple concern for his sister's health. "You suspect something," Eleanor said, watching him carefully. Alexander paused, his hands stilling over his half-packed bag. This message came without a signature, delivered by a boy no one at the inn recognizes, arriving precisely when we have begun asking dangerous questions in a town far from home. "I do not yet know if it is truth or trickery, Eleanor, but I intend to find out, and I would rather discover the answer at Isabella's side than remain here wondering." They departed within the hour, the carriage moving at a punishing pace through roads still damp from the previous night's fog. Eleanor's mind torn between worry for Isabella and suspicion of the message's true intent. Alexander remained largely silent throughout the journey, his eyes fixed on the passing countryside, his jaw set with quiet determination. As they finally approached the gates of Ashcombe Manor, as darkness settled over the estate, Eleanor noticed immediately that something felt different, wrong, in a way she could not quite articulate. Too many candles burned in the windows for such a late hour, and figures moved hurriedly across the courtyard as their carriage rolled to a stop. Mr. Collins met them at the door, his face pale and drawn with worry. "Your Grace," he said breathlessly, "thank heavens you have returned. Lady Isabella took ill 3 days past, quite suddenly, and the physician fears it may be something more sinister than ordinary illness. She has been asking for you constantly." Eleanor and Alexander rushed through the halls together, arriving at Isabella's chamber to find the young woman pale and weak against her pillows, her usually bright eyes dulled with fever, though they flickered with recognition and relief the moment she saw her brother enter the room. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I am glad you have come." Alexander knelt beside her bed immediately, taking her hand gently in his own. "What happened, Isabella? Tell me everything you remember." Isabella struggled to focus her thoughts, her words coming slowly, interrupted by weak coughing. "I took tea in the garden," she said, "as I always do, in the afternoon. But it tasted strange, bitter beneath the usual sweetness, and within an hour, I felt as though the entire world had begun spinning around me." Eleanor exchanged a sharp glance with Alexander, both of them arriving at the same terrible conclusion simultaneously. "Someone poisoned the tea," Eleanor said quietly, careful not to alarm Isabella further with the harshness of the accusation spoken aloud. The physician, an elderly man named Dr. Whitfield who had served the family for decades, confirmed their fears once he was called back to examine Isabella again in their presence. The symptoms suggest a substance not commonly found in nature, he said gravely. Something administered deliberately, and in a dose meant to weaken rather than immediately kill, perhaps as a warning rather than an attempt at murder itself. A warning, Alexander repeated, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Aimed at me, delivered through my sister's suffering. Eleanor placed a steadying hand on his arm, feeling the tension coiled beneath his skin, like a spring wound too tight. We will find whoever did this, she said firmly, and Isabella will recover. Dr. Whitfield caught it early enough, thanks to her own strength in enduring these past days. Isabella, despite her weakened state, managed a faint smile toward Eleanor. I always wanted a sister, she murmured, before drifting into an exhausted sleep, her hand still resting gently in her brother's grip. Later that night, once Isabella had been settled and the household had finally quieted, Eleanor found Alexander standing alone in the darkened garden where his sister had taken her fateful tea, staring at the small stone bench, as though it might reveal the answers he so desperately sought. They will not stop, he said quietly as Eleanor approached, without turning to face her. First my father, now my sister. They are testing how far they can reach into my life before I am forced to surrender. Then we do not surrender, Eleanor said firmly, stepping to stand beside him. We fight back, with everything we have learned and everything we continue to discover. Your sister is alive, Alexander. That means whoever did this failed, at least this time, and every failure leaves behind clues they did not intend to leave. Alexander turned to look at her then, and in the moonlight filtering through the garden trees, Eleanor saw an expression she had not seen from him before, something raw and unguarded, gratitude mixed with a depth of feeling that went beyond simple partnership or duty. I do not know what I would do if something happened to you as well, he said quietly. I brought you into a marriage I promised would be different from what you feared, yet I have also brought you into danger I cannot fully control. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, echoing the gesture he had offered her in the carriage days before. You did not bring me into danger, Alexander, she said gently. You brought me into truth, and truth has always carried risk. I would rather stand beside you facing danger honestly than live a lifetime of comfortable lies, the way I was raised to expect. They stood together in the quiet garden for a long while, the weight of the day's revelations settling around them, until finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice steady with renewed resolve. Tomorrow, we begin looking more closely at who has access to this household, who serves our meals, who tends our gardens. Someone within these walls made this possible, whether knowingly or through careless trust placed in the wrong hands. Eleanor nodded, her own resolve hardening to match his. Then tomorrow, we start again, she said. And this time, we will not stop until every shadow in this house has been brought into the light. Above them, the moon disappeared briefly behind a passing cloud, and somewhere in the servants' quarters on the far side of the manor, a young gardener who had been newly hired only weeks before lay awake in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a guilt that grew heavier with every hour that passed since he had unknowingly added something to Isabella's tea tray, at the request of a stranger who had paid him more coin than he earned in an entire month of honest work. By morning, Isabella's fever had broken, much to the relief of the entire household, though Dr. Whitfield insisted she remain confined to her bed for several more days, while her strength returned fully. Eleanor sat with her for a portion of the morning, reading aloud from a book of poetry, while Alexander met privately with Mr. Collins, to begin a quiet review of every servant who had joined the household within the past year. You have a gentle way about you, Isabella said, during a pause in the reading, studying Eleanor with newfound curiosity. Alexander wrote to me before the wedding, saying he hoped for a marriage built on honesty rather than convenience. I confess I did not entirely believe such a thing was possible between two strangers, brought together by arrangement. And now? Eleanor asked, setting the book aside. Now I think perhaps my brother chose more wisely than either of us realized, Isabella said with a faint smile. Though I would ask that you take care of him, Eleanor. He carries burdens he rarely speaks of, even to those closest to him. Our father's death changed him in ways I do not think he has fully allowed himself to grieve. Eleanor considered this, filing away the observation as another piece of the man she was slowly coming to understand. I will do my best, she promised. Though I suspect he intends to take care of me in equal measure, whether I ask for it or not." Isabella laughed softly, the sound weak but genuine, before exhaustion pulled her back toward sleep. Eleanor left her resting peacefully and made her way toward the study, where she found Alexander poring over a list of names, with Mr. Collins standing anxiously nearby. "We have narrowed it to 3 individuals hired within the past 2 months," Alexander said without looking up as Eleanor entered. "A stable hand, a laundry maid, and a young gardener named Thomas Whitfield, no relation to the doctor, hired to assist with the estate's extensive grounds." "Have you questioned them?" Eleanor asked. "Not yet," Alexander said. "I want to approach this carefully. If one of them is responsible, direct confrontation may only cause them to flee before we learn who truly sent them." Eleanor nodded, understanding his caution. "Perhaps I could speak with them individually. Informally," she suggested. "As Bridget taught us, people often reveal more when they do not feel accused, only heard." Alexander agreed, and over the course of the afternoon, Eleanor found reasons to visit each of the 3 newly hired staff members in turn, engaging them in seemingly casual conversation about their work, their families, their reasons for seeking employment at Ashcombe Manor. The stable hand and laundry maid seemed entirely unremarkable, their answers consistent and unhurried, their manner relaxed in ways that suggested no hidden guilt. But when Eleanor found the young gardener, Thomas, tending to the rose beds near the garden where Isabella had taken her fateful tea, something in his demeanor shifted the moment she approached. His hands trembled slightly as he continued working, and he avoided meeting her eyes, even as he answered her polite questions about the garden's upkeep. "You seem unwell yourself, Thomas," Eleanor observed gently, watching him carefully. "Is something troubling you?" Thomas's hands stilled entirely, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring down at the soil beneath his fingers, as though searching for courage he could not quite find. Finally, he looked up at her, and Eleanor saw genuine anguish in his young face. "Your Grace," he said, his voice barely steady, "I have done something terrible, and I do not know how to undo it." Eleanor kept her expression carefully calm, though her heart raced at his words. "Tell me," she said softly. "Whatever it is, I promise to listen before judging." Thomas's story came out slowly, haltingly, punctuated by tears of genuine remorse. A stranger had approached him in the village weeks before his employment even began, offering him a substantial sum of money simply to add a small vial of clear liquid to any tea served in the garden on a particular afternoon, with no explanation given as to its purpose or effect. Desperate to send money home to his ailing mother, Thomas had agreed, never imagining the liquid could cause real harm. "I did not know it would hurt her," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I thought perhaps it was only meant to make someone unwell for a day, nothing more. When I heard Lady Isabella had fallen so gravely ill, I nearly came forward immediately, but I feared what would happen to me. What would happen to my mother if I lost this position?" Eleanor felt genuine sympathy mixed with the seriousness of what he had done. "Did you see this stranger's face clearly? Would you recognize him again?" Thomas nodded eagerly, relieved to finally be sharing the burden he had carried alone. He had a scar along his left cheek, and he spoke with an accent I did not recognize. "Not from these parts at all. He met me near the tavern at the edge of the village, always at dusk, always alone." Eleanor thanked him gently and assured him that his honesty would be considered when decisions were made about consequences, before hurrying back to share what she had learned with Alexander. When she relayed Thomas's description, Alexander's expression grew sharp with recognition. "A scar along the cheek," he repeated. "That matches a description given to me once of a man in Silas Reeve's employ, someone used for tasks too dangerous or dishonorable for Reeve to handle personally." "Then we have our connection," Eleanor said. "Nathaniel and Reeve, working together, using intermediaries who never fully understand the scope of what they are asked to do." Alexander nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "Understanding the connection does not yet give us proof strong enough to bring before a magistrate," he said. "Nathaniel is careful. Every thread we pull seems to lead to someone else entirely, someone who can be silenced or who disappears before they can testify against him. Then we need someone who cannot simply disappear," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "Someone with standing of their own. Someone Nathaniel cannot so easily threaten or bribe into silence." Alexander considered this for a long moment, before a new idea seemed to take shape behind his eyes. "My father's solicitor," he said slowly. "A man named Edmund Harlow, who who managed my father's private affairs for over 20 years. If anyone might have documentation of my father's true wishes regarding the estate, documentation that Nathaniel could not simply steal or destroy, it would be him. Where does he reside? Eleanor asked. In the city, Alexander said. I have not visited him since the funeral. I confess I avoided it, uncertain what memories such a visit might stir, but perhaps it is time to finally seek him out. Eleanor placed a comforting hand on his arm. Then we will go together, she said. Grief postponed does not disappear, Alexander. It only waits. Perhaps facing both the grief and the answers at once will prove easier than facing either alone. Alexander looked at her with an expression of quiet gratitude that spoke more clearly than any words could have. You continue to understand things about me that I have not even fully understood about myself, he said softly. Perhaps that is what marriage should be, Eleanor replied, echoing sentiments she was only beginning to fully believe in herself. Not simply two people tolerating one another's presence, but two people helping each other see clearly what they could not see alone. They departed for the city 3 days later, once Isabella had recovered enough strength that Dr. Whitfield deemed her fully out of danger, and once Alexander had arranged for additional trusted guards to watch over the estate in their absence, a precaution neither of them wished to leave to chance again after the events of the past week. The journey to the city took a full day, and as their carriage finally rolled through the busy streets toward the address Alexander remembered for Edmund Harlow's office, Eleanor found herself studying her husband's profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the careful way he seemed to be steeling himself for whatever memories this visit might stir. Whatever we learn today, Eleanor said quietly, as the carriage slowed to a stop, know that you do not face it alone. Alexander turned to her, and for a moment, something passed between them that went beyond words entirely, a silent acknowledgement of the partnership that had grown steadily stronger with every trial they had faced together since that first uncertain night in the ducal bedchamber. Then, taking a steadying breath, he opened the carriage door and stepped out into the bustling city street, Eleanor close behind him, both of them unaware that inside the very building they were approaching, Edmund Harlow had already received a visitor earlier that same morning, a visitor who had left behind a substantial sum of money and a very clear, very quiet warning about what might happen should certain documents ever find their way into the wrong hands. Edmund Harlow's office occupied the second floor of a narrow building near the edge of the financial district, its windows dusty with age and its door bearing a brass plate so worn that the lettering had nearly faded away entirely. When Alexander knocked, the door opened after a long pause to reveal an elderly man with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he ushered them inside. Your Grace, Harlow said, his voice carrying a note of surprise mixed with something that looked distinctly like unease. I did not expect a visit. Please, come in, though I fear my office is not prepared for such distinguished guests. Eleanor noticed immediately the way Harlow's gaze flickered toward the window before settling back on them, and the slight tremor in his hands as he gestured them toward two worn leather chairs facing his cluttered desk. Something about his manner felt guarded, careful in a way that suggested fear rather than simple nervousness. We have come regarding my father's affairs, Alexander said once they were seated, watching Harlow closely. Specifically, regarding certain documents you may still hold, pertaining to the estate, and to shipping arrangements my father made in the final months of his life. Harlow's already pale face grew paler still, and he busied himself unnecessarily with papers on his desk, avoiding Alexander's gaze entirely. I fear I do not have much to offer on that front, he said, his voice strained. Your father's estate was settled properly through the usual channels. I cannot imagine what further documentation you might require. Eleanor watched him carefully, noting the way his hands would not stay still, the way his eyes darted toward the door as though expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. Mr. Harlow, she said gently, leaning forward slightly. Has someone visited you recently? Someone who perhaps suggested it would be wise to forget certain records ever existed? Harlow's composure cracked visibly at her words, his hands finally stilling as he stared at her with something between relief and terror. How could you know that? He whispered. Because we have encountered the same tactics elsewhere, Alexander said quietly, understanding dawning in his expression. Mr. Harlow, whatever threats have been made against you, we can offer protection, but we need the truth. My father's death was not natural, and I believe you know more than you have been willing to say." Harlow's shoulders sagged, decades of careful discretion finally giving way beneath the weight of fear he had clearly carried for far too long. "A man came to me 3 weeks past," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He did not give his name, but he left money on my desk and made it very clear what would happen to my daughter, who lives alone in the countryside, should certain papers ever surface. I have a family to protect, Your Grace. I am not a brave man." Eleanor felt her heart twist with sympathy, even as urgency pressed at her from within. "We understand your fear," she said, "but silence has not protected anyone in this matter, Mr. Harlow. It has only allowed those responsible to continue causing harm. Alexander's sister was poisoned only days ago as a warning. If we do not find proof soon, others may suffer as well, perhaps even your own daughter, should these men decide silence is no longer sufficient insurance against discovery." Harlow's face crumpled with visible anguish, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, wrestling silently with the weight of his decision. Finally, he rose from his desk and moved to a small safe, hidden behind a false panel in the wall, his hands shaking as he worked the combination. "Your father suspected something was wrong in the months before his death," Harlow said, as he retrieved a thin leather folio from the safe. "He came to me privately, asked me to record everything he had discovered, and instructed me to keep it hidden, to be revealed only if something happened to him that seemed unnatural. I have carried this secret alone for 2 years, Your Grace, terrified of what would happen should I ever act on his instructions." He placed the folio on the desk before them, and Alexander opened it with hands that trembled slightly of their own accord. Inside were detailed notes in his father's careful handwriting, describing suspicions about shipments of goods that did not match their official manifests, meetings observed between Nathaniel and a man matching Silas Reeves' description, and finally, a chilling final entry, dated only 2 days before his death, expressing fear that he had been discovered investigating, and that his own safety could no longer be guaranteed. Eleanor read over Alexander's shoulder, her heart aching at the raw fear evident in the late Duke's final written words. "This is proof," she said quietly. "Real proof, in his own hand, describing exactly what he suspected before he died." "It may be enough to bring before a magistrate," Alexander said, though his voice carried a weight of both vindication and fresh grief at finally confirming what he had long suspected. "But we will need more than suspicion recorded in a private journal. We need evidence connecting Nathaniel and Reeve directly to the act itself." Harlow, having finally unburdened himself of the secret he had carried so long, seemed to find renewed courage as he spoke again. "There is something else," he said. "Your father mentioned a witness, a dock worker who claimed to have seen Reeves' men loading something onto a ship the very night before your father fell ill, something your father believed was not simply cargo, but a substance meant to be delivered secretly into the manor's stores. Do you know this witness's name?" Alexander asked urgently. Harlow shook his head. "Your father did not record it, perhaps out of caution, fearing these very papers might one day fall into the wrong hands. But he mentioned the man worked regularly at the docks, near where Percival Grant's warehouse once stood, before Grant himself vanished." Eleanor and Alexander exchanged a determined glance, both of them recognizing the path forward, now taking clearer shape before them. "We return to the coast," Alexander said. "This time, we search not for a merchant who has already been silenced, but for a witness who may still be willing to speak, if we can find him, before Nathaniel's men do the same." Before they departed, Alexander insisted on arranging protection for Harlow and his daughter, dispatching a trusted guard to accompany the old solicitor and ensure his safety, while the investigation continued. Harlow's gratitude was evident in the tears that finally spilled down his weathered cheeks as he thanked them both profusely. "I should have come forward sooner," he said, as they prepared to leave. "I let fear silence me when your father trusted me to speak, should the worst ever happen. I am sorry, Your Grace, for the time this cowardice has cost you." Alexander placed a firm but gentle hand on the old man's shoulder. "You have spoken now, when it matters most," he said. "That is what my father would have wanted, and what I choose to remember, rather than dwelling on time we cannot reclaim." As their carriage pulled away from Harlow's office and began the journey back toward the coast, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how much had changed in the span of just over a week since their wedding night. The frightened bride who had braced herself for silent endurance had transformed into a woman actively pursuing truth and justice, alongside a husband who valued her insight as much as her presence. "You have grown quiet again," Alexander observed, watching her thoughtfully from across the carriage. "I am thinking of how different this all feels from what I expected," Eleanor admitted. "I imagined myself spending these early days of marriage learning to simply survive alongside a stranger. Instead, I find myself hunting truth alongside a partner." Alexander reached across and took her hand, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting between them over the past week. "And how does that feel?" he asked, "in comparison to what you were taught to expect?" Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. "It feels like waking up from a long sleep," she said finally, "as though I had been taught to accept a smaller version of life than the one I was truly capable of living." Alexander's expression softened with something that looked remarkably like tenderness. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "we are both waking up together." The carriage continued onward, through the darkening countryside, carrying them back toward the coast and whatever answers still awaited them there, while behind them, in the city they had just left, a figure watched from across the street, as Edmund Harlow's newly assigned guard settled into position outside the solicitor's office, memorizing every detail before disappearing into the crowd to report what he had witnessed to a master growing increasingly anxious about how quickly his carefully constructed secrets were beginning to unravel. The second journey to the coast felt entirely different from the first, colored now by the weight of proof they carried, and the urgency of finding a witness before Nathaniel's reach extended to silence him as well. Eleanor spent much of the journey reviewing Harlow's folio again and again, searching for any detail that might point them toward the mysterious dock worker mentioned in the late Duke's final entries. "He mentions the warehouse near Grant's former property several times," Eleanor said, tapping the page thoughtfully. "Perhaps if we speak with the dock workers there directly, someone will remember who worked those particular nights, especially if it involved unusual activity that stood out from ordinary trade." Alexander nodded in agreement, though his expression remained tense with the knowledge that time was working against them. "We must also consider that Nathaniel may already be searching for the same witness," he said. "If Reeves' men grow nervous enough, they may attempt to silence anyone with knowledge of that night, whether we find them first or not." Upon arriving at the harbor town once more, they took greater precautions than before, arranging to stay at a different inn under different names entirely, and dressing in plainer clothing to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Eleanor once again ventured into the market and docks, disguised as an ordinary woman seeking information, while Alexander made discreet inquiries among the dock workers themselves, presenting himself as a merchant seeking to hire experienced hands for future shipments. It was Eleanor who found their first genuine lead, speaking with a fisherman's wife who mentioned her husband had grown unusually troubled in recent weeks, refusing to discuss certain nights of work at the docks, drinking more heavily than he ever had before, and waking from nightmares that left him shaking and pale. "He will not speak of it to me," the woman confided quietly, glancing around with obvious nervousness. "But I fear something he witnessed weighs on him terribly. He has grown afraid of shadows, afraid of strangers, in ways he never was before." Eleanor gently pressed for the man's name and where he might be found, and the woman, after a long hesitation, finally provided the information, extracting a promise from Eleanor that no harm would come to her husband as a result of whatever truth he might reveal. The fisherman, a broad-shouldered man named Walter Finch, proved difficult to locate at first, avoiding his usual haunts along the docks, as though sensing danger in every corner. It was only as evening fell and Eleanor and Alexander finally found him drinking alone at the furthest table of a dimly lit tavern that they were able to approach him directly. "Walter Finch," Alexander said quietly, sitting across from the startled man before he could flee. "We mean you no harm. We seek only the truth about a night some months past, a night involving unusual cargo and men who paid well for silence." Walter's face drained of color entirely, and his hands gripped his tankard so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I do not know what you speak of," he said, though his trembling voice betrayed the lie immediately. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "We know you witnessed something that has haunted you since," she said. "We know men were paid to keep quiet about a shipment that was never simply ordinary trade. We are not here to punish you, Mr. Finch. We are here because a good man died as a result of what you saw, and his family deserves to know the truth." Walter's composure finally broke, tears welling in his tired eyes, as months of suppressed fear and guilt spilled forth in a rush of hurried, desperate words. "I saw them loading crates marked as ordinary goods," he said, his voice shaking. "But I heard two men talking as they worked, speaking of a substance meant to be delivered quietly into a great house further inland. Something meant to look like natural illness rather than what it truly was. I did not understand the full meaning until weeks later, when I heard talk in town that the old Duke of Ashcombe had died suddenly, and something inside me knew, with terrible certainty, that I had witnessed the beginning of his end." "Did you see the faces of these men?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "One of them, yes," Walter said. "A tall man with a scar along his cheek. The same man who paid me and every other dock worker that night a full month's wages, simply to forget what we had witnessed and never speak of it again. I have been afraid every day since, afraid he would return to ensure my silence permanently." Eleanor felt a surge of vindication mixed with fresh grief on Alexander's behalf, the description of the scarred man matching exactly what Thomas the gardener had described weeks before. "Would you be willing to testify to what you witnessed before a magistrate?" she asked gently. "Your testimony, combined with other evidence we have gathered, could finally bring justice for a man who was murdered and protection for others who might otherwise suffer the same fate." Walter hesitated, fear still evident in every line of his weathered face, before finally nodding slowly. "I have carried this alone long enough," he said. "If it means an end to living in fear, then yes, I will speak the truth, whatever the cost to myself." Alexander promised him protection and fair compensation for the risk he was taking, and arrangements were quickly made to have Walter transported safely to the city under careful guard, away from the harbor town where Nathaniel's associates might still be watching. As they prepared to depart with their crucial witness finally secured, Eleanor felt a profound sense of momentum building beneath everything they had endured over the past 2 weeks. "We finally have enough," she said to Alexander, as they walked back toward their inn beneath a sky scattered with stars. "A witness, a written record from your father himself, and a connection between Nathaniel and the substance used against him. Surely this is enough to bring before a magistrate now." Alexander's expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant, his experience with Nathaniel's careful maneuvering tempering any premature celebration. "It should be enough," he agreed, "but Nathaniel has resources and influence that reach further than we might expect. We must present this evidence carefully, to someone Nathaniel cannot easily corrupt or intimidate into dismissing our claims." "Who would you suggest?" Eleanor asked. Alexander considered for a long moment before answering. "There is a magistrate in the capital, Justice Aldridge, known throughout the region for his uncompromising integrity," Alexander said. "My father spoke highly of him on several occasions. If anyone can be trusted to weigh this evidence fairly, without fear of Nathaniel's influence, it would be him." "Then we go to the capital next," Eleanor said, determination steadying her voice despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones after weeks of relentless investigation. As they walked, Alexander glanced at her, with an expression that carried more warmth than exhaustion could dim. "You have transformed this entire pursuit," he said quietly. "When I began this search for truth, I imagined myself facing it alone, as I have faced every difficulty since my father's passing. I did not imagine finding someone who would stand beside me through every step of it." Eleanor felt her heart swell at his words, the walls she had built around her own feelings during weeks of danger and uncertainty, softening in the quiet warmth of his gaze. "I did not imagine it either," she admitted softly, "but I find that I would not wish to face any of this without you now, whatever comes next." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other beneath the star-filled sky, something unspoken passing between them that went beyond partnership in investigation and into something far deeper, something that neither of them had expected to find within the confines of an arranged marriage, born from necessity rather than choice. That night, as Eleanor lay awake in her narrow inn bed, reflecting on the weeks that had passed since her frightened wedding night, she found herself thinking not of fear or duty, but of the quiet strength that had grown steadily within her, nurtured by a husband who had chosen to see her as an equal, rather than a burden to be managed. Whatever awaited them in the capital, whatever final confrontation loomed with Nathaniel and his allies, she felt ready to face it, not out of tolerance or resignation, but out of genuine partnership and, though she was only beginning to admit it fully to herself, something that felt remarkably like love. Miles away, in a well-appointed study within his own estate, Nathaniel Cross sat before a roaring fire, reading a hastily written report that informed him of his cousin's continued investigation and the disturbing news that a dock worker from the harbor town had gone missing from his usual home that very evening. His expression grew cold and calculating as he folded the letter and tossed it into the flames, watching it curl and blacken before turning to the man waiting silently across the room for instructions. "It seems," Nathaniel said quietly, "that patience has run its course. Prepare the men. We will not allow this matter to reach the capital." They departed for the capital at first light, Walter Finch, traveling in a separate, heavily guarded carriage, arranged by Alexander, to ensure his safety throughout the journey. Eleanor sat beside Alexander in their own carriage, the folio of evidence resting securely in a locked case at her feet, her nerves taut with anticipation of what awaited them once they finally reached Justice Aldridge. They had traveled only a few hours when Alexander's driver suddenly called out in alarm, the carriage lurching to an abrupt stop that threw Eleanor forward against the opposite seat. Through the window, she saw a fallen tree blocking the narrow forest road ahead, far too deliberately placed to be the result of natural causes. "Stay down," Alexander said sharply, pulling Eleanor away from the window even as he reached for the pistol concealed within his coat. Before either of them could react further, the carriage door was wrenched open from outside, and a masked figure reached in, grabbing for the locked case at Eleanor's feet. Alexander moved instantly, striking the man's arm away and forcing him back with surprising speed and strength. But shouts erupted from multiple directions as more figures emerged from the surrounding trees. Eleanor's heart pounded violently as she realized they had walked directly into an ambush, precisely as Alexander had feared might happen should Nathaniel grow desperate enough. She reached instinctively for the small dagger Alexander had insisted she carry, hidden within her skirts since their journey to the coast began, her hands trembling but her resolve holding firm. "Get to Walter's carriage," Alexander commanded, positioning himself between Eleanor and the door as more shouts echoed through the forest. "I will hold them here." "I am not leaving you," Eleanor said fiercely, refusing to budge despite the danger closing in around them. There was no time for further argument as two more masked men appeared at the carriage door. Alexander fired his pistol once, striking one assailant in the shoulder and sending him stumbling backward with a cry of pain, but the numbers against them were clearly too great for a single weapon to hold back indefinitely. Suddenly, shouts of alarm rose from further down the road, followed by the sound of additional horses approaching at a gallop. Eleanor peered cautiously past Alexander's protective stance and saw, to her overwhelming relief, that Mr. Collins had arrived with a contingent of estate guards, having grown suspicious enough of the journey's risks to follow at a careful distance with reinforcements. The tide of the confrontation shifted rapidly as the estate guards engaged the attackers, and within minutes, the remaining masked men fled back into the surrounding forest, abandoning their wounded companion rather than risk capture. Alexander lowered his pistol slowly, breathing hard, before turning immediately to check on Eleanor, with an expression of raw fear, finally breaking through his usual composure. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands moving over her shoulders and arms, as though needing physical confirmation that she remained unharmed. "I am well," Eleanor assured him, though her own hands trembled as the full weight of what had just occurred began to settle over her. "Truly, Alexander, I am unharmed." Alexander pulled her into a firm embrace then, something he had never done before in the weeks of their marriage, his relief evident in the way he held her as though afraid to let go. "I nearly lost you," he murmured against her hair. "I brought you into this danger, and I nearly lost you." Eleanor allowed herself the comfort of his embrace for a long moment, before pulling back slightly to meet his eyes. "You did not lose me," she said firmly. "We are both still here, and Nathaniel has just shown his hand more clearly than ever before. An ambush on a public road, Alexander. That is not the action of a careful man confident in his innocence." Mr. Collins approached them then, his expression grim, as he gestured toward the wounded assailant now being restrained by two guards. "Your Grace," he said, "this one may know something useful, given the right encouragement to speak." The wounded man, once his mask was removed, proved to be a hired mercenary rather than someone with direct knowledge of Nathaniel's full scheme, though under careful and firm questioning, he did confirm that he and his companions had been paid handsomely by an intermediary to intercept a carriage carrying important documents, with explicit instructions that the documents were to be destroyed and any witnesses silenced permanently if necessary. "This confirms everything," Eleanor said, once the man had been secured for transport, to face justice, alongside whatever charges awaited him. "An attack on the road to the capital, timed precisely with our journey. Nathaniel knows exactly what we carry, and how urgently he wishes to stop us." Alexander nodded grimly, though something in his expression had shifted since the attack, a hardening resolve that Eleanor recognized as the transformation of grief and fear into focused determination. "Then we do not delay any further," he said. "We continue to the capital immediately, with additional guards surrounding us the remainder of the journey. Nathaniel has shown he is willing to risk violence in the open. That recklessness will be his undoing." The remainder of the journey passed without further incident, though tension remained high among the entire traveling party, guards riding vigilant watch at every turn of the road. When they finally arrived at the capital 2 days later, weary but unharmed, Alexander wasted no time in arranging an audience with Justice Aldridge, presenting their case with the full weight of evidence they had gathered across weeks of careful investigation. Justice Aldridge, a stern-faced man, with sharp, intelligent eyes, listened carefully as Alexander laid out the late Duke's private journal, Harlow's testimony regarding the threats made against him, and finally, Walter Finch's first-hand account of witnessing the poisoned shipment being loaded under cover of darkness. "This is substantial evidence," Justice Aldridge said finally, after reviewing every document with careful, methodical attention. "Combined with today's attempted ambush and the mercenary now in custody, I believe we have sufficient grounds to bring formal charges against Lord Nathaniel Cross and his associate Silas Reeve." Eleanor felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Weeks of danger and uncertainty finally beginning to find resolution within reach. Alexander, beside her, appeared momentarily overwhelmed himself, the weight of 2 years of quiet grief and suspicion, finally validated by the promise of formal justice. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to conceal. "My father deserved better than the silence surrounding his death. This is the first step toward finally giving him that justice." Justice Aldridge nodded solemnly. "Warrants will be issued immediately for the arrest of both men," he said. "Though I must warn you, Your Grace, men facing such serious charges sometimes grow more dangerous rather than less, once they realize the net closing around them. I would advise continued caution until both men are safely in custody." As they left the courthouse that afternoon, the weight of accomplishment mixed uneasily with lingering apprehension. Eleanor found herself walking closely beside Alexander through the busy capital streets, her hand naturally finding his without conscious thought, a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing over the past weeks of shared danger and growing trust. "It is nearly over," Alexander said quietly, though something in his tone suggested he did not entirely believe his own reassurance. "Nearly," Eleanor agreed, equally aware that Nathaniel, cornered and desperate, might prove more dangerous in these final days than he had been throughout the entire investigation that preceded this moment. That evening, as they settled into rooms at a respectable inn within the capital to await confirmation that the warrants had been properly executed, a messenger arrived bearing urgent news that made Eleanor's blood run cold with dread. Nathaniel Cross, upon learning of the warrant issued for his arrest, had fled his estate under cover of darkness, taking with him a small contingent of loyal men, and disappearing entirely from any known location. "He has gone into hiding," Alexander said grimly, reading the report with a mixture of frustration and renewed vigilance. "Which means he remains free to act, and a cornered man is often the most dangerous kind of all." Eleanor felt the familiar weight of fear settling over her once more, though this time it was tempered by the strength she had discovered within herself over the course of their journey together. "Then we remain vigilant," she said firmly, "and we trust that justice, having finally begun to move, will not be stopped now, not after everything we have sacrificed to bring it this far." Alexander looked at her with an expression of deep admiration, and something that had grown steadily warmer with every passing day of their partnership. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "I am grateful beyond words that I do not face it alone." Outside their window, the lights of the capital city flickered against the darkening sky, and somewhere within its winding streets, Nathaniel Cross moved carefully through shadowed alleys, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, his mind already turning toward one final, desperate plan that he hoped might yet reverse his rapidly deteriorating fortunes before justice could finally catch up with him entirely. 3 days passed with no further word of Nathaniel's whereabouts, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on the entire household when Eleanor and Alexander finally returned to Ashcombe Manor, escorted by extra guards Justice Aldridge had insisted upon as a precaution. Isabella, fully recovered from her ordeal, greeted them with tearful relief, and the estate settled into a tense, watchful quiet as everyone waited for news of Nathaniel's capture. It was during this uneasy period that Eleanor received an unexpected visitor of her own. Her mother, Margaret Whitmore, arrived at Ashcombe Manor unannounced one afternoon, her face etched with worry after hearing rumors of danger surrounding her daughter's new household through letters from mutual acquaintances in the county. "Eleanor," her mother said, embracing her stiffly in the manner she had always shown affection, careful and restrained rather than warm. "I heard the most alarming things. Is it true there has been violence, that your husband's own cousin conspired against his family?" Eleanor led her mother into the drawing room, where they sat together over tea, and found herself recounting, in careful terms, the events of the past weeks. Her mother listened with growing alarm, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap as the story unfolded. "You have been placing yourself in danger," her mother said finally, distress evident in her voice. "Eleanor, this is not what I prepared you for. I taught you to keep your head down, to endure whatever came your way quietly, precisely so you would never find yourself entangled in such perilous affairs." Eleanor felt a flash of the old deference rise within her, the instinct to apologize, to promise better behavior, to shrink back into the smaller version of herself her mother had always encouraged. But something steadier held firm within her now, forged through weeks of standing beside Alexander as an equal rather than a passenger in her own life. "Mother," Eleanor said gently but firmly, "I understand you meant to protect me with the lessons you taught, but those lessons would have left me powerless to help my husband, powerless to protect his sister, powerless to seek justice for a murdered man. Enduring quietly would not have kept me safe, Mother. It would only have kept me small." Her mother's expression flickered with something Eleanor had rarely seen there before, a mixture of hurt and something that looked almost like buried longing. "You speak as though tolerance was a failure on my part," she said quietly. "I only ever wanted you protected from disappointment." Eleanor reached across the small table and took her mother's hand, a gesture of tenderness rarely exchanged between them throughout Eleanor's entire life. "I do not think you failed me, Mother," she said softly. "I think you were taught the same lessons by your own mother, lessons meant to protect women from a world that rarely valued their voices. But Alexander has shown me a different way, one where a husband and wife stand together, rather than one simply enduring the other. I wish, more than anything, that you might have known such a possibility existed for yourself as well." Tears welled unexpectedly in her mother's eyes, a rare display of vulnerability that startled Eleanor deeply. "Your father was not a cruel man," her mother said quietly, as though confessing something long buried. "But he was distant, and I learned early that expecting warmth only led to disappointment. It was simpler, I told myself, to expect nothing at all, and therefore never be disappointed by what I did not receive." Eleanor squeezed her mother's hand gently. "It does not have to remain that way," she said. "Perhaps it is not too late to expect more, even now." Her mother wiped at her eyes hastily, embarrassed by the rare display of emotion, though something in her posture seemed to soften, as though a burden she had carried for decades had shifted slightly beneath the weight of her daughter's words. "Perhaps," she said softly, "you are wiser than I ever gave you credit for being." Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of Mr. Collins, his face pale with urgency, as he hurried into the drawing room without his usual careful formality. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Eleanor directly since Alexander had ridden out earlier that morning to consult with the estate's guards along the northern boundary, "a message has arrived. Lord Nathaniel has been sighted near the old chapel ruins at the edge of the eastern woods, and Justice Aldridge's men are moving to apprehend him even now." Eleanor's heart leapt with a mixture of hope and alarm. "Where is my husband?" she asked urgently. "He rode toward the northern boundary this morning," Collins said. "Word has been sent, but it may take time to reach him, given the distance." Eleanor rose immediately, her earlier conversation with her mother momentarily set aside in the face of this pressing development. "Send word to the guards at the eastern woods that I am coming," she said firmly. and ready a horse for me immediately."
"Eleanor," her mother said, alarm evident in her voice, as she too rose from her seat.
"Surely this is a matter for the men to handle. You should remain here, safely within the manor walls." Eleanor turned to her mother, and in that moment, something passed between them that transcended the years of careful lessons and quiet resignation that had shaped their relationship until now. "Mother," she said gently but with unmistakable resolve, "this is exactly what I have been trying to explain. I cannot simply wait quietly while the man I love faces danger without me. I choose to stand beside him, not because it is expected of me, but because it is who I have become." Her mother's eyes widened slightly at the word love spoken so plainly, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she might argue further. Instead, something shifted in her mother's expression, a dawning understanding that seemed to settle over years of hardened resignation, like the first gentle thaw of a long winter. "Then go," her mother said quietly, surprising Eleanor entirely. "And Eleanor, be careful. Whatever else I taught you wrongly, know that I have never wished for anything less than your safety and your happiness, even if I did not know how to properly encourage the second." Eleanor embraced her mother briefly before hurrying to change into riding clothes and mount the horse Collins had prepared. She rode hard toward the eastern woods, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, arriving just as the sounds of a commotion echoed through the trees ahead. She found the scene near the old chapel ruins, in chaos, Justice Aldridge's men closing in around a small group of Nathaniel's remaining loyal followers, while Nathaniel himself stood near the crumbling stone entrance, a pistol raised and pointed directly at Alexander, who had apparently arrived just moments before Eleanor herself, having received word faster than anticipated through a rider intercepted along his own path. "Nathaniel," Alexander said steadily, his hands raised slightly, though his voice remained calm despite the weapon pointed at him. "This ends now. There is nowhere left for you to run." "I built everything I have through careful patience," Nathaniel snarled, his composure finally shattering under the weight of his unraveling schemes. "And I will not surrender it to a cousin who was simply born into fortune he never earned." Eleanor's heart pounded as she dismounted quickly and moved carefully closer, careful not to draw immediate attention that might startle Nathaniel into rash action. "You poisoned an innocent man," she called out firmly, drawing Nathaniel's startled gaze toward her. "You harmed a young woman who never wronged you. Whatever justification you have constructed for yourself, Nathaniel, it does not change what you have become." Nathaniel's eyes flickered between Eleanor and Alexander, something desperate and cornered flashing across his features, as Justice Aldridge's men continued closing the distance around him. "Stay back," he warned, his pistol wavering slightly between them both. In that moment of hesitation, one of Aldridge's men moved swiftly from the shadows of the ruins, disarming Nathaniel before he could react further, the pistol clattering harmlessly to the ground as Nathaniel was forced to his knees, finally and completely overcome by the justice he had so desperately tried to evade. "It is over," Alexander said quietly, relief evident in every line of his exhausted frame, as he crossed quickly to Eleanor, checking once again for any sign of harm, despite her having arrived only in time to witness the conclusion, rather than participate in the danger itself. Eleanor allowed herself to be pulled into his embrace, the tension of weeks finally beginning to release from her shoulders, as Nathaniel was led away in restraints, his schemes finally and completely unraveled, after 2 long years of carefully constructed deception. "You heard what I said," Eleanor murmured against Alexander's chest, suddenly aware of the words she had spoken so freely to her mother, and now, indirectly, to Nathaniel and everyone within earshot. Alexander pulled back slightly to look into her eyes, his own expression filled with a warmth that made Eleanor's heart swell with an emotion she had denied herself the full acknowledgement of until this very moment. "I did," he said softly, "and I find that I have been waiting weeks to hear it, though I confess I did not expect the confession to occur during the apprehension of a criminal." Eleanor laughed despite the exhaustion and lingering tension of the encounter, a genuine, unguarded laugh that felt like the final release of every fear she had carried since her wedding night weeks before. "I love you, Alexander," she said again, more clearly this time, savoring the truth of the words as they left her lips. "And I love you, Eleanor," Alexander replied without hesitation, his own words carrying the weight of certainty, built not from a single dramatic moment, but from weeks of shared danger, shared trust, and the slow, steady discovery of a partnership neither of them had dared to hope for when their arranged marriage first began. As they stood together amid the fading chaos of the chapel ruins, the late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds overhead, Eleanor felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she was not simply enduring her circumstances, but actively shaping them, standing as an equal beside a man who had chosen to see her worth from their very first conversation, and who had proven, time and again, that partnership built on truth and trust could overcome even the darkest of conspiracies. The trial of Nathaniel Cross and Silas Reeve unfolded over several tense weeks in the capital, with Justice Aldridge presiding over proceedings that drew considerable attention from across the region. Walter Finch, despite his earlier fears, testified with quiet dignity about what he had witnessed at the docks, his account corroborated by the late Duke's own journal entries and the physical evidence gathered from Percival Grant's ransacked home, along with testimony finally recovered from Grant himself, who had been discovered alive, but held against his will on a remote property owned secretly by Reeve, freed at last by Aldridge's investigators in the days following Nathaniel's capture. Eleanor sat beside Alexander throughout every session of the trial, her presence a steady source of strength, as old grief and new vindication mingled within him. When the final verdict was delivered, condemning both Nathaniel and Reeve for their crimes, Alexander's shoulders sagged, not with sorrow, but with the release of 2 years of unbearable tension finally allowed to dissolve. "It is finished," he said quietly, as they left the courthouse for the final time, the autumn air crisp and clean against skin that had grown accustomed to the stale tension of legal proceedings. "My father can finally rest, knowing the truth has been spoken and justice has been served in his name." Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. "He can rest," she agreed, "and so can you, Alexander. You have carried this burden long enough." They returned to Ashcombe Manor, to find the estate transformed by an atmosphere of genuine relief and celebration, the household staff no longer burdened by the quiet fear that had lingered over every corner of the manor for months. Isabella, fully recovered and radiant with joy at her brother's vindication, threw herself into planning a celebration befitting the occasion, insisting that the entire county be invited to mark not only justice served, but the beginning of a new chapter for the Hartley family. Eleanor's mother arrived early for the celebration, and Eleanor noticed immediately a subtle but unmistakable change in her demeanor, a softness that had not been present during their earlier conversation weeks before. Margaret Whitmore embraced her daughter with genuine warmth this time, holding her a moment longer than her usual reserved affection typically allowed. "I have been thinking about what you said," her mother admitted quietly, as they walked together through the manor gardens, away from the bustling preparations for the evening's festivities. "About expecting more, even now." Eleanor looked at her mother with curious hope. "And what have you concluded?" Her mother paused near a blooming rosebush, her fingers brushing gently against the soft petals. "I have decided that it is not too late to expect kindness from your father, even after all these years," she said. "I spoke with him plainly last week, for the first time in perhaps decades, about what I truly wished our marriage might become. He was surprised, I think, though not unwilling to listen." Eleanor felt a surge of hope and pride swell within her chest. "That is wonderful, Mother," she said sincerely. "It is never too late to ask for more than mere tolerance." Her mother smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed her entire face. "Perhaps you have taught me something, after all," she said softly. "Though I still believe I taught you a great many useful things as well, even if my greatest lesson turned out to be one I did not intend to give." Eleanor laughed warmly, linking her arm through her mother's as they continued their walk through the gardens, a newfound closeness blossoming between them that neither had thought possible only weeks before. That evening, as the celebration filled Ashcombe Manor with laughter, music, and the warm glow of candlelight, Eleanor found herself standing beside Alexander, on the terrace overlooking the gardens, watching guests mingle and dance beneath strings of lantern light strung carefully among the trees. "Do you remember our wedding night?" Alexander asked quietly, his arm wrapped comfortably around her waist, as they watched the celebration unfold before them. Eleanor smiled softly at the memory, so different now in retrospect than it had felt in the frightened uncertainty of that first evening. "I remember being terrified," she admitted, "and I remember you telling me that tolerance was not a marriage, but a sentence. I meant every word, Alexander said, turning to face her fully, his eyes reflecting the warm candlelight from the manor windows behind them. Though I confess I did not yet understand, on that night, how completely you would prove those words true, through your own courage and strength. Eleanor reached up and gently touched his face, marveling at how far they had traveled together since that first uncertain evening. My mother taught me to simply endure, she said softly. But you taught me that a true partnership requires so much more than endurance. It requires trust, honesty, and the courage to stand together, even when facing the greatest of dangers. Alexander leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a tender gesture that spoke of the deep affection that had grown steadily between them since their arranged marriage first began. I am endlessly grateful, he murmured, that fate brought us together, even through circumstances neither of us chose for ourselves. As they stood together beneath the starlit sky, surrounded by the joyful sounds of celebration and the promise of a future built on genuine partnership rather than mere obligation, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a peace she had never imagined possible on that frightened wedding night weeks before. Months later, as autumn gave way to winter and the first snow began to blanket the grounds of Ashcombe Manor, Eleanor received a letter from her mother, filled with news of a gentler, warmer relationship blossoming between her parents after decades of quiet distance. Eleanor read the letter aloud to Alexander by the fire in their private sitting room, her heart full with quiet joy at the transformation her own courage had helped inspire within her family. It seems, Alexander said, watching her fondly from his seat across the hearth, that your influence has extended far beyond the walls of this manor. Eleanor smiled, setting the letter aside and moving to sit beside him, curling comfortably against his side as the fire crackled warmly before them. Perhaps it has, she said softly, though I could not have found this courage without you showing me, first, that it was possible. We found it together, Alexander corrected gently, wrapping his arm around her as she settled against him, as we have found everything else since that very first night. Eleanor closed her eyes, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, and thought once more of her mother's old warning, spoken with such resigned certainty on the eve of her wedding. Just tolerate it, Eleanor. That is what every woman before you has done. But Eleanor had not simply tolerated her marriage. She had transformed it, and in doing so, had transformed herself entirely, discovering a strength and partnership she had never known was possible, guided by a husband who had chosen, from their very first conversation, to see her not as someone to be endured, but as someone to be cherished, trusted, and loved completely, exactly as she was. And as the snow continued falling softly outside the windows of Ashcombe Manor, wrapping the estate in a peaceful, quiet blanket of white, Eleanor knew with complete certainty that whatever challenges the future might yet bring, she would face them not with quiet endurance, but with the same courage and partnership that had carried her safely through the storm of the past several months, standing always beside the man who had taught her, on their very first night together, that love was never meant to be simply tolerated, but fully and joyfully embraced.